Hello, and welcome to Module 3, Developing a Broadband Roadmap and Building Broadband Partnerships. My name is Scott Woods. I'm a Senior Broadband Program Specialist with NTIA. You would have seen me in the previous module number 1. And again, we're going to get started right away because, again, all of this information that you're going to be working to develop is going to help the community. You may have members of the community who are watching this presentation as well. So we're going to dive right in and we're going to get started. So let's look at the NTIA Broadband Planning Roadmap. These are the steps that we are going to encounter and address today. Again, all of this information, all of the data, all of the student-led information that you're going to develop and capture will aid the community in going through these steps. Okay, so again, engaging stakeholders. You do that throughout the entire life cycle of this continuum. All right, we're going to go through each one of these step by step. And again, when you get to that decision point, when the community gets to that decision point, to consider both an infrastructure strategy and solution and a digital inclusion strategy and solution, we'll work with that as well. Again, typically, all of the money, all of the focus is on infrastructure, working with service providers, building and expanding broadband facilities and assets. But we found throughout the numerous work that we've done in the community that a tangential approach is actually the most beneficial. So in addition to all of the infrastructure support, we also have to look at digital inclusion, access, and equity. So we're going to go ahead and roll through the broadband planning map. Again, the importance of planning generally, you need to understand that each stage, plays a different role. There is a progression to the process, but no required order. And it's really going to depend on the level of sophistication and engagement of each community. And you always plan with the end goal in mind. So in working with the community, the base roadmap should include 3 things: vision and goals, anticipated benefits, some type of strategy and call to action. What the students will be working on is ultimately that strategy and that plan to action, the framework, if you will, that information that will be needed to drive the community strategy, action, and working with local service provider, or going on their own and building a municipal network, or even enticing a new entrant to come in and provide broadband access and infrastructure and connectivity to its residents. Your roadmap will identify new partnership opportunities. And we've talked about that in previous modules as well. So let's look at the continuum. As I stated in the introduction, broadband success requires both infrastructure and inclusion, right? So we're going to engage our stakeholders. We're going to assemble our teams. We're going to harness the data. We're going to identify priorities. And then we're going to get to that point where we have to include both an infrastructure strategy and a human capital strategy. That is that digital inclusion, that access, that equity. So let's deal with the first step, right? Engaging stakeholders is a full continuum, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But the first step is assembling that team to identify those community priorities. When assembling a team, you want to compose the team based on the mission of the project, and you also want to include a mix of skills, varying backgrounds or viewpoints, and an interest in achieving a common goal. And so you want to ask yourself, what is the objective, right? We talked about this in previous modules, right? Some communities will focus purely on economic growth. Some will look to enhance educational opportunities, both in K through 12 and the higher education institutions. Some would just like to expand institutional connectivity to their schools, to the hospitals, to the libraries, to the government buildings and government service. Some will just want expanded e-government services. Again, think about where we are now with the vaccine, where we are now with COVID numbers, being able to track and have data on community exposure and community spread, right? You need expanded e-government services to be able to accomplish all of that. But you also have to consider that strong partnerships will provide financial and personnel resources and increase your project's impact. Again, so those initial partnership considerations are very important. Who's going to provide the funding? Who's going to own the assets? Where all these sub-resources will come from? The skills, the personnel, the experience, the availability. All of that has an impact on the overall project. And again, students, you are not going to do this. The information that you're going to collect will aid the community in making some of these decisions and embracing and executing the precise strategy. We also know that communities will use defined objectives to shape that vision, and they'll use that vision to direct planning teams to support broadband efforts. Again, this is just a different way of showing it, but again, those who pursue economic growth, will want to have members from the government representatives. They want to have local development organizations involved. They want to have members of the service provider community and business leaders, both local and regional business leaders, focusing in on economic growth. If you're pursuing an institutional connectivity, meaning you want to make sure all of your critical anchor institutions, your community anchor institutions, have broadband connectivity, your hospitals, your libraries, your business parks, you want to have representatives from those organizations involved in your team. And again, these last two we talked about, obviously with education, you want to have the educators involved, your library leaders, and your parents, parents and parental groups involved. And as I stated previously, the community will engage stakeholders throughout the entire life cycle of this timeline. There is not one stage where you are not engaging or should not be engaging with your key stakeholders. So again, while it's listed as the first step, but you actually go through this and engage throughout the entire process. And there's a reason why we engage stakeholders throughout the entire life cycle of this process, right? We want to tailor our planning efforts to community preferences. We want to make sure we have strong relationships. We want to seek areas of agreement. We want to reach new people, new stakeholders, bring new decision makers to the table. And again, we want to ensure that we're sharing all of this information. And again, so we can have more people on board with the execution of whatever strategy the community decides to achieve and pursue. We also understand that community leaders can make stakeholders a critical part of their ongoing broadband planning and execution efforts, right? Those key stakeholders at the initial phase, right, that planning phase, should include your state and local officials, right? In many states now, they have broadband offices. They have planning and infrastructure grant programs. They're coordinating with a larger federal grant program to provide broadband infrastructure or digital access and inclusion activities in the community. So you want to ensure that you involve them in the beginning stages of whatever strategy that you're going to pursue. But then you also want to look at your business leaders. You want to include your local service providers. And then as you get to the network completion stage or implementation stage, you want to ensure that the community organizations and individual citizens, right, those loud voices, those champions, you want to ensure that they're on board as well. We also understand that effective stakeholder outreach helps establish project support through the entire life cycle. And it's important to establish two-way communications because the information constantly changes. And you want to make sure that you are engaging in clear, concise communications. And then for the public trust, you want to ensure transparency and making sure that no one has any questions about the process, how decisions were made, who were involved in the decisions, and how the money will ultimately be spent. So let's talk about harnessing the data real quick. This will be a placeholder because we have a module that talks about harnessing the data and the steps that you'll need and you'll undertake to do that, utilizing a lot of our NTIA resources, but also other publicly available resources that will provide an overview as well. So that topic will cover, data accessibility and utilization, right? Reviewing the federal broadband data sets, reviewing the NTI data and mapping tools, right? Discussing external tools like speed tests and other broadband now and pricing data that's available. And then you'll have an opportunity to explore your own data. And if there are any community members here in attendance or watching this, you'll have an opportunity to get all of this information. You'll have a really good understanding of your service area, your constituent area. And again, you will utilize that information as you talk to your local service providers, as you submit information for grant programs, as you work with other communities and organizations about what your needs are. And for the students, this information is really key because we're preparing you for what you're going to do, whatever track that you end up pursuing professionally, right? You have to understand, no matter environmental, business, politics, right? Everything now involves data and really understanding data, understanding demographics, understanding local communities and the makeup, and being able to articulate that. So, students, the information that you're going to provide to these communities will definitely help them. We've made it, I think, really easy for you to access that information. And so stay tuned for the next module, and you'll get all of that insight on a one-to-one basis. And so, as I talked about at the top, right, any good solution, any good planning foundation and structure considers both infrastructure, the physical assets, and inclusion. That's the human capital portion, right? The people, right? And so we want to ensure that as we build and expand the physical assets, we have the people and that they're trained and they have devices and we're ready to go when that network is completed and in operation. This also helps with surprise, surprise, revenue generation, right? Because the more people, the more users that are on the network, the more paying customers that are on the network, the easier it is for sustainability and again, to attract a certain business model to ensure the project's completion and successful operation. And as I mentioned at the top, this is just a regurgitation slide, and I want to burn this slide into your memory. Again, you're going to reach a point where you'll have to have dual tracks. And oftentimes, our experience has been, communities, really focus on infrastructure. They really focus on, the physical assets, but not really the human capital component. We have a digital inclusion module that really goes through all of the digital inclusion programs one by one. So I encourage you to watch that. But I think if you don't take anything away from this presentation, understand that to be successful, you got to have dual track. And understand, these are not the same people who are doing the work. You might have half of your team really knowledgeable and focused on working with service providers, expanding infrastructure, and you have the other half that may be working on digital inclusion, access, and equity, making sure that there are underserved populations in the community, that they have the devices, and we understand that service is affordable. Affordability is a big play in the successful implementation of any broadband plan and strategy. So let's talk about digital inclusion just for a second. Right. Digital inclusion ensures that individuals and communities have access to robust and affordable broadband connections, and that the internet-enabled devices meets their needs, and that they have the skills to explore, create, and collaborate in the digital world. We understand that aspects of digital inclusion, includes more than just computers and devices. It's the technical help and support. It's the training. It's all of that combined into one. And so we really need a specific strategy to ensure that once that in-network infrastructure is completed and we have broadband access and connectivity, that we also have the people and the devices to be able to run on them. And more importantly, the people are able to utilize them, again, in a pandemic to ensure we're lessening the impact of a pandemic or any other type of a disaster on them. And again, it's not just in a worst case scenario. If you look at the transition of our communities, if you look at the transition of the jobs of the future require some form of technical skill, right? And so again, although we're training, although we're providing equipment and devices, again, we want to ensure that our communities are set up to succeed as we move forward in this new digital economy.